Hello and welcome to the Simply Tax Halftime Report brought to you by BKD CPAs and Advisors. Everyone needs a trusted advisor. Who's yours? I'm your host, Damien Martin. It's July 30, 2021, and wow, have we seen some action out there inside the Beltway. Would you agree, Damien?
You know, I really would, Damien. Things have been heating up when it comes to the prospect of major tax change, with the infrastructure portion of President Biden's Build Back Better agenda front and center, following the enactment of the $1.9 trillion pandemic relief and stimulus bill, the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA as it's known, that was signed into law on March 11th. Damien, I'll hand it back over to you for a play-by-play on what we've seen so far.
Thanks, Damien. Coming into 2021, we had a sense of what proposals we might see based on the campaign proposals of the president. However, there was a lot of speculation around what that might look like. On March 31st, we learned more about Part 1 of his two-part plan with a fact sheet outlining his American Jobs Plan and Made in America Tax Plan, which focus on rebuilding infrastructure and promoting green energy and will be paid for with corporate tax increases. Then, on April 28th, the fact sheet for President Biden's American Families Plan was released, giving us more insight into the president's policies focused on domestic priorities that would be paid for with tax increases on high-income Americans. Things came into focus even more on May 28th with the release of the president's budget and Treasury's so-called Green Book, which provides explanations for changes and details on the president's proposals, which you can learn more about with the archive of the June 10, 2021 webinar I moderated with my colleagues Holly Ponzer, Patricia Quintana-Perone, and Jeff Lehman that we've included a link to in the show notes of this episode. And finally, in keeping with the action at the end of the month trend here, on June 24th, a $1.2 trillion bipartisan deal on hard infrastructure was announced in the Senate. And on Wednesday, July 28th, in what's considered a big step forward after failing a test vote in the previous week, 17 Senate Republicans joined all 50 Senate Democrats in a vote to force the start of debate on the compromised package, though the details and the legislative text are still being worked out.
That was well summarized there, Damien. It sounds like at halftime we know more about the tax-related legislative proposals, but there's still a lot more we've yet to learn, with the outlook uncertain and many details yet unknown. That brings us to today, and I'm excited to share with you a conversation I had with Travis Lucas of the Lucas Law Firm on where things stand as we head into the August recess.
All right, Damien. You know, I'm really looking forward to hearing from Travis as well. Before we do, let's check in with colleagues Randy Throener and Chris Doolittle for some perspective, context, and the biggest concerns they're hearing based on what they're seeing in the field from those they work with. Randy, what are you seeing out there?
The biggest concern is, where are capital gains rates going? And ultimately, what does that mean for the transfer of assets to heirs, and how do they plan for that? And then I think also the general thought in that about if a transaction can be done this year, do we need to think about doing that? And it's really difficult right now because there's so much uncertainty. And so how do you prepare yourself for what you don't know is ahead? And I think the key part of that is everybody's really looking at their planning structure and saying, if we have to jump and do something relatively quickly, because when we do have more definitive guidance, how do we handle that? I think the planning is the part. If you did want to do an accelerated transaction or gift or work through some of the estate issues, have you talked to your attorneys? Do you have an idea of what that looks like? Because if you wait till we may have guidance, that timing can be very difficult, and you may not have the option to react, even if you can.
And I guess, Chris, with that, the uncertainty here, what are some things from a planning perspective, or what are the ways that you can prepare for what we don't actually know yet?
Yeah, I think one of the hard ones we've got, and let's just use an example, we've got a client that owns multiple different entities, and the hard part she's facing is making this decision of a gift, which is kind of what Randy was bringing up. And she's in this deal where, okay, I've got to value all these things. And to really get a gift done by the end of the year, I've got to go through a lot of exercises. I'm going to be out evaluation cost. I'm going to be out trust created by attorneys. And I could get to the end of the year, and it's possible it could change the law in such a way that gift is retroactive in nature. And if I go through with my decision at that point in time, all of a sudden I've got taxes that I owe that I would not have owned if I pulled that gift. So now there's this question of, okay, I do all this planning. and I have all this upfront cost, and I might be doing it all for nothing. I think that's kind of a scary place to be as a client. I can tell you, we've met with her. I think this is the third time we've met and planned through it. And when that planning turns into more of a discussion of how do I do this with this upfront cost and these issues and not know where I'm going, I feel uncomfortable. And she is stressed about it. And I don't blame her. It's not an easy place to be. But the planning is she's doing exactly what I think she needs to do. She's not used all of her lifetime exemption. She's somebody that has wealth way over that limit. But she's in a stressful situation, not just normal stress of making the gift and going through those decisions, but now struggling with how do I move on all this when I can't pull the trigger and have a known result? That's a scary situation to be. To use a similar example, we've also got a client, and this goes down the path Randy was talking about as well. A couple years back, they tried to sell. The buyer, unfortunately, fell through, had financial issues, couldn't get the backing. But now they've kind of raised up as a family and said, maybe we want to try this again. But you read the numbers and work through the details, and their multiple has to go from, let's call it a 7 to a 10.5 to pay for the taxes that could happen. And so, of course, that family has sat there and talked to our capital advisors, and they're just like, folks, there's no way we're going to go from an 8 to 10.5 multiple. It's not going to happen. And so they're faced with that decision of, okay, maybe we wait a little bit and do this again. So maybe those two examples give some real credence to this really tough situation our clients are in, making decisions with real unknowns in front of them.
It's a struggle. I don't know, Randy, you seeing similar things? It sounds like it, right? Kind of going through all this and top of mind and stress. I don't know. What do you think?
We've had several clients that I think are looking at accelerating deals. And for the same reason, right?
Okay.
The multiples can't grow enough for me to make enough by waiting, that maybe I wait for 2 or 3 years to get either increase in revenues or EBITDA that affect that multiple. Well, that's fine. But I might be at a net zero gain position because in 3 years, when I pay these higher tax or these cap gains rates, where am I going to end up? And it's going to be the same place. So why hold on for 2 or 3 more years and take the risk of downside? And I'm not reaping any benefits because of the tax rates. With that said, now put yourself in a position. Suppose that does go retroactive. And again, no one knows the answer to that. Certainly I don't. But if it did, then why would you accelerate at all? You're going to pay the tax one way or the other. Now I maybe need 2 or 3 years of that upside. And now the risk reward is totally different. Now there's some reward for waiting, growing the business, increasing the EBITDA so that the multiple generates enough to get back. But you're asking people to plan when they have no idea. And the bigger question is, and maybe you can answer this, Damien, is when do you think we'll have more clarity? I mean, they'll come back from the summer recess. What does that look like?
That is certainly the top question on everyone's minds these days there, Randy. And to help me answer it, I'll now turn it over to guest Travis Lucas. Travis, would you help break things down, starting with breaking down a little on who you are?
Thank you for having me, Damien, on this podcast. And I'm hopeful that this is going to impart some wisdom and some knowledge on everyone listening. I got involved in politics pretty early in life, growing up in Texas. At that point, Texas was changing politically, going from a Democratic to a Republican state. So I've actually worked for Democrats and Republicans, and I always say they don't make people like me anymore. Later on in life, I ended up becoming a judge and really honing this talent of being able to call balls and strikes. I did that from the bench, giving everybody a fair ground to litigate their cases. And I certainly do that now for my clients on the public policy scene. Don't get real political. I just call balls and strikes. And so really what I've done here in Washington is being able to assess what's going on in Congress, the agencies, real broad tectonic plates that are shifting in the policy arena, and then assessing what might happen to give certainty to my clients so they can make the best decisions possible. And, through all that, it's been, time as an attorney, a chief of staff on Capitol Hill, working in agencies, but also as a full-time, practicing attorney in a lot of these policy areas, especially as it relates to tax.
The most frequent question I'm getting these days, as I'm sure you are, is what's the latest? What's going on? What's the, if we're going to go with baseball, what's the score here? What are the stats on some of these conversations around infrastructure and some of Biden administration's agenda items here?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's start with some broad stroke propositions. I would say that every elected official and their senior staff, there's a lot that they're thinking about, but one thing they're really thinking about are the 2022 midterm elections. Because the future campaign always drives the policy agenda for the most part, especially at the leadership levels, Democratic, Republican, House, Senate, and those types of things. And so, knowing, I'd say, second, that the Democratic leadership know that they've got a second bite at the apple in terms of the budget reconciliation package. We already did one, ARPA, back in March. They've got another one to go this year, and then they'll have at least one more to go next year, probably first quarter in 2022, with more than likely the House potentially flipping. So they know, even the White House knows, that they've got to win big on these budget reconciliation packages. So if we start with that as a framework for our discussion, that's the main thing that everyone needs to understand. And then this budget reconciliation that we'll perhaps come back to a little bit more in detail in a moment, that is slated for really a fall vote. It's going to be a big, big bill. We're talking about potentially $3.5 trillion, maybe a little south of that. But its success is really hinging to some degree on what happens in the next 2 or 3 weeks with respect to this bipartisan infrastructure package, and also, secondly, the budget resolution. So just to kind of think about it, there's really 5 tectonic pieces of policy that are coming together right now. The $579 billion bipartisan infrastructure package, that's the first one. That's the one that quite a few people are looking for it to come to fruition this week, actually. Second is the budget resolution out of the Senate, which then would follow the budget reconciliation package. And then they've got also the fiscal year 2022 appropriations bills, which is really going to culminate into a continuing resolution. And then finally, number 5, the debt ceiling. So all of these all come together, these right now separate tectonic plates shifting and beginning to collide together. So it's fascinating to watch how the horse trading is taking place.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, maybe just in terms of appreciating the seismic shift here, or the magnitude, I guess, if you will, of these tectonic plates coming together, I feel like in the last, we'll call it 18 months, we've seen some pretty large price tags on some of the relief packages and the legislation that came out in response to the pandemic, right? I mean, how does, I guess, in the more regular, non-global pandemic environment, a $3.5 trillion budget reconciliation bill stack up?
Yeah, how do they stack up? Well, you're right. The last budget reconciliation bill that they did, American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA, $1.9 trillion, had a little bit of everything for everybody in it. And now we're looking at other pieces of the president's Build Back Better plan, whether that's the American Families Plan, the American Jobs Plan, the Made in America tax plan. That's just from the White House side of the coin. There are a lot of other discussion points from people like Senator Wyden to Frank Pallone, Chairman Pallone, who's the chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee, like the LIFT Act, all of these things, big price tags. But again, if you're of a particular political persuasion, this is your golden hour. Because let's pause for a moment. This is really critical for our listeners to understand. And you can actually incorporate this tool that I'm about to tell you with your city governance, like your city councils, your state legislators, all the way to the well of the Senate. And it's real simple. And that is, how many votes does it take to get something passed? So if you can get proficient at vote counting, you can pretty much figure out what's going to pass and what's not. That's kind of a little bit going off your question there, but it is one worth pausing and talking about. Typically on most bills in the U.S. Senate, you need 60 votes. And there's a whole variety of reasons for that. It's mainly because of filibusters and cloture and things like that. But just know that you need 60 votes. You need 218 in the House. So, but when it comes to budget reconciliations, so that's the one we're talking about that's coming up this fall. It's the one that ARPA was dealt with. It's actually how Reagan got his 81, 82 tax package through. Bush did it. George W. Bush did it. Trump did it with the 2017 tax bill. So it's been around. The ACA was done that way. But for those budget reconciliation bills, you only need 51 votes. So right now, the Democrats have 50 seats, and they can use the vice president for that 51st vote. You still need 218 in the House. And the one that you're going to see probably the first, second quarter of next year, that's going to be a budget reconciliation vote. Probably going to be the public options going to be in there, incidentally, with a lot more tax policy on that. But I'm really going down a rabbit trail if we get into that. You're going to have to see more of this, not necessarily COVID protection, but really what they frame it as, building back America from, being in the economic doldrums last year. Hey, they've got the votes and they're going to go for it.
In this environment, I feel like because the margins are so narrow, if you will, there's going to be a lot of posturing. There's going to be a lot of horse trading, and counting those balls and strikes maybe not be as easy. Is that true? And how are you going about that?
Yeah, exactly. And so, even though theoretically the Senate has 51 votes for budget reconciliation, it really depends on what's in the content of that reconciliation bill, correct? So, for instance, there seems to be, in fact, I was with, I can't get in a lot of detail, but I was around, I'll just say, some pretty powerful U.S. senators just last week. Interesting conversations where I did my own little internal polling about, hey, what do you think about this, that, and the other? And, there seems like there's a little bit more vote, if you will, right now for, things like the stepped up basis. I'm not saying they've got 51 votes. I was surprised to learn that there are more Senate votes there than what I suspected. And I'd also say, carried interest, the changes with carried interest, even the 1031 like-kind exchanges, there seems to be more of a sentiment or a favorability there. Whereas ones on, let's say like capital gains, that's still a moving target. They're all moving targets, don't get me wrong, but a little bit less votes for not necessarily changing that rate, but changing it to as high a rate as what's being proposed, you see. So depending on what we looked at, especially the tax policy, if we were to carve out and just talk about, where are they on child tax credit versus where are they on carried interest, we're going to have different shifting vote patterns there. And that's exactly what Senate Majority Leader Schumer and his whips and many others, when they're trying to cut this deal, is figure out, all right, hey, where are you on this? Because we need to know, because that then affects what we do on the spending side as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it's this kind of delicate balancing act, it kind of sounds like, right? Make sure you tally the votes and where you need them, but then you don't lose some on the other side, perhaps?
That's exactly right. It's like pushing a balloon. You push one way, it pops out the other, and you don't necessarily want it to pop out the other. So one thing that's favorable with one particular group may cause another group to not favor the other policies. Yeah, and the trick is really just trying to bring it all together.
You mentioned kind of this rabbit trail. I think I might follow you down here a little bit on the difference in, again, as this balancing act. You get the bipartisan piece, right? And that there aren't maybe some tax components in there, but maybe the reconciliation piece would.
Can you maybe unpack that a little bit, or I guess use your metaphor, go down the rabbit trail a bit?
Yeah, with respect to the budget reconciliation bill, you can't just put anything into a budget reconciliation bill. There's a whole branch of political science almost on how budget reconciliations are orchestrated and what can be in there and that type of thing. But essentially, they have to be revenue spending bills. And the Senate parliamentarian weighs those features and also the other non-germane, if you will, tax and spending features that go into them. I can tell you, right now, the reason that price tag's so high, or not high enough, depending on your perspective, is that it's loaded with a lot of domestic policy provisions, social infrastructure, not just hard infrastructure like roads and bridges, but social infrastructure. So, we're talking about, like, for instance, $400 billion for home and community-based servicing, a lot of low-income housing features, green energy components and things like that. But to also pay for some of that, that's why you have a lot of the tax policy in it. So I don't think that you're probably going to see every single thing that's being proposed in the American Families Plan. Again, that's where we have the capital gains tax provisions, carried interest, the 1031 like-kind exchange, the stepped-up basis, many, many others. I don't think you'll see all of those, but you'll see, I think, most of them. And I think when push comes to shove, even though the progressive caucus, especially in the House, is saying, if we don't have this, that, and the other, we're not voting for it, I think a lot of that is posturing. I mean, they're doing what they should do, which is argue and try to get as many votes as they can for their side. But, I think at the end of the day, if they're faced with, look, this is the best we can do to get out of the Senate, they'll capitulate and they'll cut the deal.
I will say the capital gains rate is one that I do hear a lot of interest in, particularly with those that I work with and that I'm talking to, and maybe the planning for it. And there's two elements here, I would say, that are frequent topics of conversation. One is the pegging to the kind of the retroactive application, kind of back to when it was initially introduced at the end of April there. And then the other being, gosh, do you think it's really going to be that full ordinary rate, the almost doubling of the rate, which it kind of alluded to, maybe thinking that we might not go all the way there. But what are you hearing? What's your sense at this point in the game?
My sense is they can't get to, and I could be wrong, the very top rate. They just can't get the 50 votes. They're close from what I understand, but they just can't necessarily get there. Not only in the Senate, but I'll even tell you in the House. You got to remember that, and we started off the podcast with this notion that everybody's really looking at the 2022 midterm elections. I think I'm correct in this, that historically in the modern presidency, the modern congressional presidency era, in midterm elections, the president's party typically hemorrhages 27 seats. I think in 1990, George H.W. Bush probably had the best showing. And I don't know, Damien, it's something like maybe he lost like 7 or 8 seats. And you got to remember, right now in the House, there's only a 3-seat gulf. So everybody knows, with redistricting about to happen, reapportionment about to happen, which really favors a lot of Republican, or at least Republican-leaning states, the Republicans could really probably mop up in about 18 months and really do quite a bit. So those moderate Democrats right now looking at, oh my gosh, you're going to have me, potentially vote for these types of things, knowing that they're going to have a tough row to hoe. Then what it does? What it causes consternation in getting at these really high rates. I would seem to think on things like the stepped up basis, because that's one thing that, yes, it affects really, really wealthy people, but it also affects average people to some degree, at least the ones that have family farms and businesses. There is an exclusion to all of that. And hopefully that those exclusions will apply. But, right now, that's not even a certainty.
really are at this spot where almost anything's possible and some interesting results may happen. So I guess as we're looking into the fall here and maybe I guess even heading out to the August recess, what are your thoughts on timing? When can we maybe start to see some of these things start to narrow and actually start to see some legislative text that we can start picking apart?
Well, again, if you just really focus on the 5 things that are on their plate, the bipartisan infrastructure package, the budget resolution, the budget reconciliation package, fiscal year 2022 appropriations, which is going to be a continuing resolution, and the debt ceiling all coming into play. What's really ideal for the Democrats is they've got to get that bipartisan infrastructure package through. Now, on the House side, presently, the Speaker says that she wants to do the budget reconciliation bill first and then do the infrastructure package. And that's to keep her numbers together. So I really, I predict, and it's really hard to predict, but I would say that they're probably going to come through with this bipartisan infrastructure package. You may see that in the next week or two, followed by the budget resolution. That's going to drag into August. So yeah, we're going to have at least proposed August recess, but I'd say about half of it could be, totally wiped out. And then later this fall, when they come back, a vote on the budget reconciliation bill. That could be in September, could slide into October. I think if it goes past that, I just don't see it going past that. It potentially could. Remember, September the 30th is the end of the year, calendar year for government spending. So they've got to pass a continuing resolution to fund the government for the remainder of the year and that type of thing. So all those things are going to come together. Very busy, I'll say September, October, November. You're going to have, I know a lot of my financial planner and other state planning colleagues of mine, we talk about this quite a bit, how busy we're all going to be, at the end of the year. It's going to be an enormously busy year to try to help people think through all of these changes and what's best for them.
I'm sensing that as well. And especially with some of the changes like change the step up in basis. I mean, that can have some pretty big implications to existing planning and revisiting and trying to figure out what you're going to do and so forth. So it's a tough one to kind of, I guess, manage when you don't exactly know where it's going to land. But it sounds like the one thing we know is if I guess is certain is probably uncertainty in a busy fall, perhaps.
No doubt about it. But, typically I would say, at least for me and for most people who are watching these games taking place, pretty much from about June through the end of the year that's the busiest time, and definitely at the end of the year, because we always have some kind of omnibus bill that's coming through. I've seen entire industries, or at least service lines within industries, fall the wayside with bills like that. I've seen, other industries do quite well. Really behooves of people to really pay attention to what's going on, at least monitor what's going on, and to exercise your constitutional right to address Congress and tell them what you think. It still works. It's not perfect. I'm not saying it's perfect at all. This is in some ways a very broken system, but elected officials, if they hear enough from a particular industry, they do listen to that. Doesn't mean that it's going to pass that whatever somebody's interested in or be defeated, but they certainly do take heed to what people say.
That's it for today, but certainly not the end of the conversation. And I have a feeling we'll be hearing more from Travis, Randy, and Chris this fall as things continue to heat up. In the meantime, check out the resources in the show notes of this episode for more on what we know so far, and follow me on social media for developments and insights as things continue. You can find me out on LinkedIn and out on Twitter at Damien Martin CPA. You'll also find me on Instagram at TaxDad and on YouTube by subscribing to our Simply Tax YouTube channel. We value your feedback and would greatly appreciate it if you would shoot me a message, send me an email at simplytax@bkd.com, and if you would leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. I'm Damien Martin, and thank you for listening.
The information contained in this This episode of Simply Tax is based on data available as of the date of its release. BKD is under no obligation to update this information if changes occur. Applying this information to your specific situation requires careful consideration of all facts and circumstances. Any information provided is not to be considered as tax, legal, or financial advice. Please consult your tax advisor before acting on any matters covered.